There is at least one thing science and religion can agree on. Bees are pretty important.
Knowledge is power.
I'm getting handsome now, aren't I?
As I get older, they stay the same age.
I'm in heaven.
I don't want to fly. Where did you come from?
Be quiet.
That's impossible!
Hijr, or Al-Hijr, is the 15th surah or chapter of the Quran, and it is one of two chapters we will be discussing in this analysis video, the second chapter being called The Bee, or Al-Nahl, which is the 16th surah or chapter of the Quran. So I think the way we will structure this video is we will just simply approach chapter 15 first, analyze, discuss it in full, and then approach chapter 16 secondly, analyze and discuss it then. This is going to be probably a longer video, so buckle up, but I think if you sit through the ride, you will find it to be quite a thrilling one. Now, before I give you my general thoughts and opinions on chapter 15 of the Quran, I would like to first read a couple of paragraphs from my study Quran summary of this chapter, as I think these paragraphs really help set the stage for what this surah is about and will help contextualize some of the passages we dive into later in this video. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and read those paragraphs. This surah begins with a discussion of the inevitability of God's punishment and the inescapability of his decree, after whose declaration it will be too late to submit to God or defer his chastisement. It then offers responses to the Meccan idolaters' challenge that the prophet bring angels to them, and reminds them that nothing the prophet brings them would cause them to gain faith and believe. The surah also seeks to console the prophet in light of the insults and mockery he received from the Meccan idolaters, reminding him that this was a common phenomenon among prophets. The rebelliousness of the Meccan idolaters in face of the truth is then juxtaposed with the refusal of Iblis to bow before Adam when Adam was created by God. The surah goes on to recount the stories of the prophets Abraham, Lot, and Shu'aib. The account of the inhabitants of Al-Hijr, the community to whom the prophet Salih had been sent, then follows. They bear this name because they inhabited a rocky plain, Hijr, from which the surah derives its title. So now that you've got a general idea of what the content of this surah is, now let's just answer the question, did I even enjoy this chapter of the Quran? You know, I did enjoy this chapter, but I gotta say, it's definitely one of the chapters of the Quran that I found less fascinating than the others, because largely this chapter is a rehash of stuff that we've already covered in previous videos in this series. Like, we already covered the prophet Salih, we already covered Abraham, Adam and Eve, and Iblis, who's basically Satan. And so, like, a lot of this chapter I found interesting to, you know, revisit some of the stuff we'd already gone over, but honestly, I just did not get nearly as much out of this chapter as I have in previous chapters, because this is just like, well, like I said, a rehash. Overall, this chapter, not mind-blowing, but there are a few things, a few passages at least, that I did find quite striking and worth talking about. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into those couple passages in chapter 15 that I found to be particularly fascinating, striking, and worth discussing. The first passage I would like to read and discuss is chapter 15, verses 14 through 15. Were we to open for them a gate unto heaven, that they might continue to ascend through it, they would say, our eyes are merely spellbound. Nay, we are a people bewitched. So a little bit of context I think is necessary to share with respect to verses 14 and 15. This pair of verses is coming after the Meccan idolaters had asked the prophet Muhammad, like, hey man, if you're really this holy prophet who's sent by God, where are the angels around you? Don't you think that you would if you were really what you say you are, don't you think it would be a good idea to prove that you're this holy prophet by having some angels with you? That's kind of like what their their question is to Muhammad in the preceding verses. And of course the response here is that, hey, even if I did have angels with me, or better yet, even if you were taken up to heaven and you saw the kingdom of God, that still would not change your mind, because you guys aren't really after the truth. You're not really after God whenever you ask me why I haven't brought angels. You're really just trying to, hurt me and exalt yourself. Now, beyond all that we have, said here about the Meccan idolaters and whatnot, I think there's a deeper application of these verses, or I guess I should say a more broader application of these verses. There's a Muslim guy on YouTube who I find to be very interesting to listen to. His name is Hamza Yusuf. If you just type in Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, you'll find him. There are, as it turns out, quite a few people named Hamza Yusuf, but try to find the guy who's a professor in California at a college called Zaytuna. That's the one I'm talking about. He has some really interesting videos where he talks about the idea that he thinks that the reason there are so many atheists in particularly the Western world is because of light pollution. People can't see the stars. And he says, if we just turned off all the lights once a month in all of our cities and allowed people to see the heavens, that would cause a lot of people to maybe not convert to Islam, but maybe convert to the idea that God is real, or at least that there's something bigger than themselves going on. When you read these verses, were we to open for them a gate unto heaven that they might continue to ascend through it, they would say, our eyes are merely spellbound, nay, we are a people bewitched. These verses, I think, coupled with what I was saying about Hamza Yusuf, are really interesting in that these verses are saying that, basically, even if you turned off all the lights and allowed people to see the stars again in the Western world, there would still be some who would say, nah, there's nothing bigger than us. It's, those are stars, but really all they are is just a collection of atoms. There would still be just hardline atheist materialists, even if a gate was opened unto the heavens by means of the diminishing of light pollution. And so, I agree with Hamza Yusuf in saying that it would be great if people could see the stars again in major cities, and I think it would change a lot of people's perspectives, but there would still be a lot of people who would dig in their heels and say, no, there's just no way that there can be a God, even though they are gazing into the heavens. But yeah, I just thought the language in these verses was really powerful and very moving and kind of mind-blowing in some ways, and so I'm glad to have shared it. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next passage in chapter 15. All right, the next passage that we're going to read and discuss is verses 45 through 48. And these verses have to do with the afterlife in the Islamic tradition. And there's just some really interesting descriptions here of kind of the heavenly realm. Truly the reverent shall be amidst gardens and springs. Enter them in peace, secure. We shall remove whatever rancor lies within their breasts, as brothers upon couches, facing one another. No weariness shall befall them therein, nor shall they be expelled therefrom. All right, now I would like to read the footnote associated with verse 47, as I think it really helps clarify some of the very cryptic language in the passage we just read. By rancor is meant the hatred and enmity that existed among the believers during their earthly lives. According to Al-Razi, this verse alludes to the fact that since spirits in the hereafter are free from the limitations of the faculties that characterize the embodied human state, they are also free from time-bound thoughts, which are what allow rancor to come about. The couches upon which the inhabitants of paradise will sit, facing one another and reclining upon them, are elsewhere described as arrayed and embroidered. According to Al-Razi, brothers upon couches facing one another means that the souls in paradise, being freed from bodily defilements, will be in such a pure state that they will become illumined by the divine lights of the next world and will reflect their light to the other purified souls. So that stuff about the couches is just like really cool imagery, like so weird and different from what I've read in I mean, obviously the Bible is very bizarre in its descriptions of the afterlife, no doubt, but like, I don't know, this is like uniquely bizarre, is what I'm saying, compared to some other, texts that I have studied. But the other part of that footnote where it talked about rancor, now, if you're like me, rancor is kind of an odd vocabulary term. What it means is bitter, rankling resentment or ill will, hatred, malice. That portion of the footnote I think is really interesting in that, it says that time-bound thoughts are what allow rancor to come in. And I really feel like there's a lot of truth in that. So much of my, mentally ill states that I sometimes go through are as a result of my perception of time. And I become bitter and frustrated, and I almost feel trapped often in my thoughts because I have this awareness of time. And I just think it's really interesting that here in the Quran it's saying that, people who have gone on to the heavenly realm, they don't have time-bound thoughts, and so they don't have rancor anymore. That's just so profound. All right, folks, that'll do it for my thoughts on chapter 15. Now let's move on to chapter 16, The Bee. As with chapter 15, I think the opening kind of summary and description of this chapter in my studied Quran is worth reading. I think it really helps set the stage for the passages that we're going to dig into further later in this video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and read the couple paragraphs in this summary here. This surah takes its name from the discussion of God's revelation to the bee in verses 68 and 69. According to Al-Qurtubi, some refer to this surah as Al-Niham, the blessings, because of the many references to the blessings God has given to human beings. And in verse 18, it is said that his blessings cannot be counted. This surah is one of the most important of those in the Quran that point out the spiritual significance of nature. Substantial parts of this surah are devoted to the wonders of the natural world and to rehearsing the specific blessings that God has bestowed on human beings through natural phenomena, including various kinds of livestock and their benefits and uses, crops and vegetation, the celestial bodies, the sea and its bounties, and the mountains, streams, and other natural landmarks that guide human beings' travel. So yeah, that's a decent description overall of what this surah is about. Now let me answer the question of whether or not I even enjoyed this surah at all. I really enjoyed The Bee. I think this chapter of the Quran was quite a bit more interesting than chapter 15, and that there was quite a bit more new stuff and just some really powerful language in this chapter. I got a lot out of this one. The passages we're going to dig into, I promise, will be, I think, mind-blowing in some ways to you all. So buckle up. This is a really kind of deeply philosophical and kind of moving chapter in the Quran. It's not my favorite, but I do think there's some really good stuff here. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into the analysis and discussion portion of this video concerning chapter 16. So the first passage we're going to read and discuss is chapter 16, verses 57 through 60. And they assign unto God daughters, glory be to him, while they have that which they desire. And when one of them receives tidings of a female child, his face darkens, and he is choked with anguish. He hides from the people on account of the evil of the tidings he has been given. Shall he keep it in humiliation, or bury it in the dust? Behold, evil indeed is the judgment they make. So what the heck did that mean? Well, luckily my study Quran has some good footnotes that help bring out the meaning of that passage. We're first going to read the footnote associated with verse 57. And if you already forgot what verse 57 was, it was, and they assign unto God daughters, glory be to him, while they have that which they desire. All right, now let's read the footnote associated with that. Regarding the attribution of daughters to God and the Quran's rejection of it, see verses, it says a bunch of different verses, where the idolaters assigning daughters to God is contrasted with their own preference for sons, which is what is meant here by they have that which they desire. The belief that the angels were daughters of God was reportedly particular to the Kaniahaha, I don't think that's how it's pronounced, and Khuzah tribes in Arabia. Their beliefs are considered abominable primarily because they attributed offspring to God, but perhaps also because they considered the angels to be females. So what I find interesting about what we just read there is, obviously it's no surprise that, Muslims reject the idea of God having offspring. That's why they reject Christianity. They're like, hey, no, God doesn't have a son, so that's no surprise. But the part here where there seems to be this prejudice to the idea of angels being female, I find very, very odd. And I'm not exactly sure that I like it. Because from my standpoint in life, I've always thought that the more angelic half of the human species was the female half of the human species. I mean, I visited Norway a couple years ago, and I went to like this pier where there were all these incredibly beautiful Norwegian women just out there trying to get a tan, even though, they're Norwegian, so that was kind of, not going to happen for them. But I'm not kidding you guys. Like, I could not speak to these women. They were so beautiful, so angelic, that I was just like, I am not worthy. And so I just do find it strange that, like, here there seems to be like this dislike of the idea of angels being female, being represented as women. I just think that's very odd, and it goes against, I guess, all of my natural intuitions about what it means to be angelic. I don't recall if the Bible has any sort of prejudice towards the gender of angels. But anyways, let's move on to the footnotes associated with verses 58 and 59. And actually, we'll reread those verses and then read the footnotes. Because these verses, I think, are really, really good overall. And they go into a really dark historical aspect of humanity that I think is worth addressing. So let's reread verses 58 and 59, and then we'll read the footnotes. And when one of them receives tidings of a female child, his face darkens, and he is choked with anguish. He hides from the people on account of the evil of the tidings he has been given. Shall he keep it in humiliation, or bury it in the dust? Behold, evil indeed is the judgment they make. Now for the footnotes. His face darkens metaphorically describes an expression of extreme sadness and distress. That he is choked with anguish means that he is unable to speak due to his overwhelming sadness. He contemplates burying his female child in the dust, a reference to the pre-Islamic practice of female infanticide through live burial. In the warrior culture of pre-Islamic Arabia, daughters were seen as a liability, and burying them alive is alluded to in the Quran and in other Islamic accounts of the period as the common method for killing infant daughters. Sometimes this was done out of fear of poverty, and sometimes to protect or defend the father's quote-unquote honor. The Quran's condemnation of this practice, however, makes it clear that killing one's children for such reasons is among the most heinous and evil practices of the idolatrous Arabs. Evil indeed is the judgment they make refers to the idolaters' attitude toward their daughters, their sense of shame on account of them, and their practice of killing them, as well as to their attributing daughters to God himself. Ibn Ajibah says that this verse should serve as a chastisement and a warning to those who dislike daughters, an attitude that he describes as based on a satanic impulse and carried over from the practices of idolatrous times. He argues that it is incumbent upon people to show great generosity and kindness to their daughters, even more so than to their sons, and that supporting daughters receives greater reward than supporting sons. According to a hadith, the Prophet said that whoever has daughters and treats them well will be shielded from the fire of hell by those daughters. So here we have some information that I think is actually quite favorable to women. The previous verse, it's got this kind of odd prejudice towards the idea of angels being feminine. But here in these verses, this is like an explicit condemnation of infanticide towards women. I think it's obviously a great thing that this is here in the Quran. Infanticide is evil, and the fact that it's still practiced in places like China and other countries is horrific. It's great to see that in Islam there is this explicit condemnation of infanticide, not just in general, but particularly towards girls, because there is, it's no secret that there kind of has always been like a historical, like almost hatred of daughters. Like it's in many cultures, not all cultures, but many cultures, there's just an obscene and sometimes just straight up satanic hatred of girls, daughters, women, that has resulted in atrocities being done towards the female half of the human species in the form of infanticide. And here, there's not just an explicit condemnation of infanticide in the Quran, but there is, at least with respect to some of the commentators on the Quran, there's, here can be found like an exalting of women and saying, hey, not only should you not kill them, you should treat your daughters better than you treat your sons. Like they should be revered and honored. And I just find that beautiful, and I'm happy to come across that in the Quran. The next passage I would like to read and discuss concerns chapter 16, verses 65 through 67. And these verses have to do with natural phenomena and also some liquids in the Islamic tradition that are kind of highly revered, that are even described as having rivers in heaven. The four liquids are water, milk, wine, and honey. Now, Muslims are not allowed to drink, but there is a verse in here that talks about wine being a positive thing in the Islamic tradition. As I understand it, this verse is abrogated by later verses that kind of condemn drinking in general, but the idea is that wine, it's a heavenly substance and can be enjoyed in heaven, but on this earth it causes so much trouble. Wine in and of itself is not bad, but combined with human nature, it's a disaster, so let's just not use it on this earth. Wait until you're in heaven and you can drink a river of it. These verses don't have so much to do with the heavens necessarily, but just know that there are these liquids in Islam that are seen to be like particularly special, and they are water, milk, wine, and honey. Let's read these first number of verses that have to do with water, milk, and wine. And then we will get to honey afterwards. And God sends down water from the sky, and thereby revives the earth after its death. Surely in this is a sign for a people who hear. And surely in the cattle there is a lesson for you. We give you to drink from that which is in their bellies, between refuse and blood, as pure milk, palatable to those who drink thereof. And from the fruits of the date palm and the vine, from which you derive strong drink and a goodly provision. Surely in this is a sign for a people who understand. So verse 65 about water, that's kind of a straightforward verse. I don't really feel the need to dig into the commentary associated with it. But verse 66 on milk is kind of mind-blowing. So let's go ahead and reread verse 66 and then read the footnote. And surely in the cattle there is a lesson for you. We give you to drink from that which is in their bellies, between refuse and blood, as pure milk, palatable to those who drink thereof. And now for the footnote. The blessings that God provides to human beings through the cattle are also mentioned in verses 5 through 7 and verse 80 and include warmth, food, bearing burdens, and beauty. This verse adds the milk that they provide to the list of blessings from which human beings should take a lesson and for which they should be thankful. In addition to being one of the four rivers of the garden, milk was the drink the prophet chose when offered either milk or wine during his night journey. Having chosen milk, the prophet was told that he had been guided to the drink of fitra, that is, the drink of primordial purity, which is thus symbolically contrasted to wine, a drink related to notions of maturity and age. We give you to drink translates nuskikum, which can mean to provide a perpetual source of drink, since cattle provide a continuously replenished source of milk throughout most of their lives. The milk comes forth between refuse and blood, meaning that it is not contaminated by either of these impure substances that exist in the animal and also issue from it. Commentators observe that there is a barrier between the different fluids, so that neither the color, nor the taste, nor the smell of blood or refuse enters the milk, and it remains pure. The pure milk that comes forth from between refuse and blood is likened by Ibn Ajiba to the pure path of Sufism that emerges as a middle way between following the Sharia only outwardly on the one hand and seeking to cling only to pure truth and ignoring the external requirements of the Sharia on the other. Similarly, he likens it to the path of true spiritual training, which lies between the paths of sober wayfaring and ecstatic attraction. If the people of wayfaring are veiled from God and those of pure attraction have left the path of God altogether, the people of spiritual training are a barzakh, or isthmus, between these two seas, for they are ecstatically attracted inwardly and sober wayfarers outwardly. So to me, all of that information is just kind of mind-blowing. I will always think of milk in a different way, because here, it's almost like milk is being used, at least by this one commentator, as a metaphor for taking the middle way in life and in all things. I mean, and this is a common spiritual teaching across in Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, like finding the balanced way to where you're not so far to this extreme and not so far to that extreme, but finding like the true middle way. That idea is put forward in almost all religious traditions, but I have never come across that idea put forth by means of like using milk as a metaphor. Milk comes from between refuse and blood and yet is pure. It's this middle pure way. It's this white, undefiled substance that you should try to imitate. That's just such a cool idea. I guess the real moral here is that if you don't like those signs and posters that say "got milk," what are you doing? Moving on from water, milk, and wine, let's now read verses 68 and 69 that have to do with honey and, of course, the bee. And thy Lord revealed unto the bee, take up dwellings among the mountains and the trees and among that which they build. Then eat of every kind of fruit, and follow the ways of your Lord made easy. A drink of diverse hues comes forth from their bellies, wherein there is healing for mankind. Truly in that is a sign for a people who reflect. Now let's read the footnotes associated with verses 68 and 69, because this fascination with the bee that the Quran has, I find to be fascinating. So let's dig in. The content of God's revelation to the bee is understood to refer to the bee's construction of hives in the mountains and the trees, as well as in that which they build, that is, in the structures and roofs of human buildings. That which they build may also refer to the beehives constructed by human beings for keeping bees and obtaining their honey. So the idea here is that, God sustains everything, and so naturally God made the bees be the way they are. And so in a sense there is this idea here that bees are following God's command just as much as we are. They may not be conscious of it, but they're doing God's will just as much as we are whenever they take up dwellings among the mountains and the trees and among that which they build. They're fulfilling God's orders, and the fact that they do so automatically, whereas we have such trouble doing it, is something that I think is interesting. But let's go ahead and read the next portion of this footnote. The drink of diverse hues that comes forth from their bellies is honey, wherein there is healing for mankind. According to Al-Qurtubi, this verse legitimates and makes permissible in a general way seeking medicinal treatments for physical ailments, against the view of those who might argue that, since all that befalls one in life comes from God, one should simply endure illness until God decides to remove it. Regarding the healing properties of honey specifically, a man told the prophet that his brother had a stomach ailment. The prophet instructed the man to give his brother honey. When the man later returned to say that the honey had not helped him, the prophet again instructed the man to feed his brother honey, saying, God speaks the truth, and your brother's stomach lies. The man again fed his brother honey, and he was cured. Some Sufi commentators say that a knower and seeker of God, who follows the ways and commands of the Lord, as does the bee, will, like the bee, become a source of spiritual healing for others. So some really stimulating stuff there. Got to say, the prescription that Muhammad gives to this person to just keep on drinking honey to get well, I don't know if that's the soundest medical advice. I'm glad it worked, but I wouldn't say that's a general good thing. But I do like the idea, the kind of the metaphor of the bee in relation to human beings, like, where it says there at the end, if we follow the ways and commands of the Lord, as does the bee, we will, like the bee, become a source of spiritual healing for others. I really like all of that. I think that's really, really cool. It's yet another thing, where I'll go outside and I'll look at bees differently, just as the next time I drink milk, I'll look at milk differently. Again, though, I wouldn't necessarily say that if your brother is sick, telling him to drink honey is the best way to go, although honey can definitely be a healing thing for certain ailments. I do get suspicious sometimes when I read things like this, because it is kind of like Muhammad, at least in this specific instance, it's almost like it's almost like honey is like a cure-all. He doesn't know what this person's sick with, but he's just like, give him honey, it'll work. Your brother's stomach lies. Like, that's, I don't know. I don't know if that's the best example to follow whenever you come across a friend or a relative who's sick. I don't know if just saying, hey man, go to Walmart, buy some honey, you're going to be okay. I don't know if that's the right way to go. And, I know people in the comment section are going to be like, that's not really what Muhammad's saying, and you're probably right, but I don't know. I had to say what I've said, and I've said what I've said, so now we're going to move on. Verse 70 is the next verse I would like to read and discuss, and buckle up. This is not having to do with any of the drinks we've been discussing over the past several minutes, but it does have something to do with, I think, everybody at some point in their life, so I think it's a verse that's very powerful and kind of mind-boggling, so let's read it. God created you, then he takes you unto himself. And among you are those who are brought back to the weakest of ages, such that they know nothing after having had knowledge. Truly God is knowing, powerful. Now let's read the footnote associated with this verse, because clearly this verse is having to, it's talking about old age, and you can kind of make out what it's saying on its own, but the commentary, I think, really makes it clear if you're having trouble understanding. So let's read the commentary. Life is here described as a process of moving from the weakness of infancy to the strength of adulthood to the weakness of old age, as in chapter 30, verse 54. God is he who created you from weakness, then ordained strength after weakness, then ordained weakness and old age after strength. Weakness and strength are here correlated with degrees of knowledge. In verse 78, it is said, God brought you forth from the bellies of your mothers, knowing not. And the present verse describes old age, the weakest of ages, as one in which people come to know nothing after having had knowledge in their adult lives. God, by contrast, then, is knowing and powerful, indicating that his attributes of knowledge and power, unlike human knowledge and power, do not wax and wane. That God takes you unto himself is a reference to every individual's earthly death. That some reach an age when they know nothing after having had knowledge refers to the state of forgetfulness and senility that afflicts some in advanced age. This description does not negate, however, the wisdom and maturity associated with old age in the Islamic tradition, as manifested in the term sheikh, which in its most basic meaning refers to a person of advanced age, but which is used to designate a Sufi master or any person of great learning and intellectual authority. The idea here of human knowledge and intellectual capacity waxing and waning with age, as opposed to God's knowledge, power, and thinking capacity remaining constant and all-encompassing, never changing, is really powerful. Like, I think the language of this verse really demonstrates the inferiority of mankind's powers when compared to God's powers. It's also just a verse that, I don't know, it hits me close to home because I have some relatives who are getting up older in age, and they are beginning to show signs of, returning to a more childlike state in some ways. Now, I thankfully don't have any close relatives who have degraded into dementia and Alzheimer's, but I have in the past. I had a grandmother who, she, as it says here, she was brought back to the weakest of ages. She had dementia, and she was very much like a child in her old age. And that was very hard to see. I just think this is one of those verses that's just, it's really powerful because it's really accurate to the cycle of, like, just what humans go through. They come out of the womb as children knowing nothing, then they gain knowledge as adults, and they're industrious and all this stuff, and then in their old age they recede back into, a more childlike state where they don't know as much as they used to. Everybody talks about how their memory becomes less and less firm. It's really a very powerful verse because God's memory never fades, but ours does. Moving on to verse 81. And God has made shade for you from among that which he created, and he has made places of refuge for you in the mountains. He has made coats for you that protect you from the heat, and coats that protect you from your own might. Thus does God complete his blessing unto you, that happily you may submit. So the primary reason I want to talk about this verse is that phrase, he has made coats for you that protect you from the heat, and coats that protect you from your own might. That is some of the coolest language, and when we read the footnote here that kind of explains what that language means, I think you're gonna kind of like be like, okay, that phrase, protect you from your own might, needs to be like in a movie at some point involving medieval war with coats of armor, because this, I don't know, it's just the language is epic. So let's read the footnote that kind of goes into what we just read there a little bit deeper. Shade was experienced as an especially salient divine gift in the desert environment of Arabia, where it would have been relatively scarce but very necessary during the hottest parts of the day. In chapter 24, verses 45 through 46, the Quran mentions the spreading out and withdrawing of the shade as a cause for wonder at divine power and beneficence. Shade is also one of the many delights of the garden, where, unlike on earth, it is everlasting. Places of refuge refers to the caves and crevices in the mountains in which people can make dwellings, and where they may hide and remain out of the sight of possible enemies. The coats serve a similar pair of purposes. Some coats, like shade, protect you from the heat, while others, like places of refuge, protect you from your own might, referring to coats of armor that protect one in war. See chapter 21, verse 80, where the art of making armored garments was bestowed on David as a divine favor. Since all of the objects mentioned in this verse offer protection to human beings, some commentators read the final clause, that happily you may submit, with slightly different vowing to mean that happily you may be safe. That is, from the natural elements, human violence, or idolatry, and the punishment for it in the hereafter. So the idea that God bestowed upon David the knowledge of the art of armor making is just freaking awesome. And that, especially coupled with the language, coats that protect you from your own might, is just freaking so cool. I also like all the descriptions here of shade being a blessing from God, and places of refuge as well. And I think, the shade and the mountain descriptions coupled with the coats protecting you from the heat and the coats protecting you from your own might, these natural phenomena are coupled with technology that God gave man. I just feel like this verse really is consistent in its messaging, even though it's talking about natural phenomena given to humans by God, and like technological phenomena given to humans by God. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the final verse in chapter 16 that I would like to read and discuss, and it is chapter 16, verse 126. And if you would punish, then punish with the like of that wherewith you were punished. But if you are patient, then that is better for the patient. So this is one of those verses in the Quran where you're like, I hope that this doesn't mean something horrible. Kind of sounds a little violent, a little dark. So when I came across it, I was like, well, I need to dig into this one. And I'm glad I did, because the footnote associated with it, I think, brings some well-needed context. So let's go ahead and read the footnote associated with verse 126 and then discuss. If this verse was revealed in Medina, it is thought to have been revealed after the Battle of Uhud, when the Muslims saw the carnage, especially the mutilation, that the Meccan idolaters had inflicted upon their dead, and they vowed to retaliate in a more devastating way. Some say the Prophet himself made this vow after seeing his beloved uncle Hamza terribly mutilated. This verse was then revealed, enjoining the Muslims to respond only with the like of what they suffered, and, better yet, to forego retaliation altogether. The Prophet thereafter renounced his oath of vengeance and declared he would be patient. When the Quraysh eventually surrendered Mecca to the Prophet, one of the Prophet's companions said, as they prepared to enter the city, "Today is a day of vengeance." But the Prophet responded, "No, today is a day of mercy." On this day, Hind, the woman who had mutilated Hamza, was allowed to enter Islam under the general amnesty for the Quraysh, and Washi ibn Harb, the Abyssinian slave who had killed Hamza, later sought and was granted the Prophet's pardon. If you are patient, then that is better, means that it is better to forego punishing those who have wronged you and to leave their reckoning to God. Beautiful. I think all of that information there is really beautiful. And if it's true that, the Prophet had his uncle like mutilated and like murdered by these people, and then he like forgave the Meccans and the specific people who did these horrible acts, like that's like, here's like a story in the Quran of not horrific jihad, but of like forgiveness and mercy, and I find it really beautiful, and I think it flies in the face at least of some of the rhetoric you hear out there, which says that the Quran is a book of just monstrous violence. And no doubt if you check out some of the other videos in this series, there definitely are some verses in the Quran where it does seem like there are some monstrous violent aspects to Islam. But here, I find really good stuff. I mean, at first it's like, hey, just enact the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality against your enemies. But then, it has this idea, but if you're patient, then that is better for the patient. If you're patient with your enemies and you forgive them, that is a much better thing for you and your enemies than to slaughter them in the way they slaughtered your people. So I think there's a lot of really good stuff in verse 126, and more specifically in the commentary associated with it, and I'm glad to have shared it with you. Anyways though, folks, that'll do it for this analysis and review of chapters 15 and 16 of the Quran. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have read chapters 15 and 16 of the Quran and you've got thoughts or questions, please leave them in the comments section below. And if you haven't read the chapters, but you still found this video interesting, please leave your thoughts, comments, and questions in the comments section below as well. And as always, if you like this video, please like it and subscribe. Tell your friends about the channel. And never forget to